It got me all relaxed, which is a good thing. Black is the color of my true love's hair. His face is soft and wondrous fair. The purest eyes and the strongest hands. I love the ground whereon he stands. 2 rose bushes stood outside of a widow's cottage. One twined around the other. One bloomed white and the other bloomed red. And within the cottage lived the widow and her 2 daughters, one snow white and the other rose red. And while the sisters were as close as sisters would be, they were also as different as sisters often are. Now Rose Red, she was of red hair and a fiery disposition, and her favorite place was outside in the forest. She would find where the fox had hid her kits that year. She would figure out where the fawns were nesting with their mothers, and she would find the mushrooms hiding in those dark spaces. And her sister Snow White, dark of hair and dark of eye, her place was the home. She would sweep the house within an inch of its life. She would take the kettle and she would shine it until it gleamed as if it was gold. And every day she would gather wildflowers and bring them to the middle of the table to add a little bit of color to the room. Now they both loved their mother as much as each other, and you would often find the 3 of them together. In the summertime, they would be down beside the river, and their mother would take great joy in reading her daughter a book, or her daughter's books, or perhaps singing them a song she knew. And Rose Red would cut the rushes from beside the river and bring them to Snow White, who would weave them into baskets to take to market. And in the wintertime was Snow White's favorite, because they would gather around the hearth, and Rose Red would card the wool that they had gotten from their small flock of sheep, pulling the fibers straight, pulling the burrs out, and handing great piles of the white fluff to her sister Snow White, who would then spin it into long white thread, while their mother sat with them and read and sang. And so it was on a night like this, when the wind whipped up and the hearth seemed cheerier for the cold outside, that they sat around the fire doing these tasks, and there was a knock at the door. "Rose Red," said their mother, "go to the door and find who is there. Perhaps it is some poor traveler, and we must offer him the comfort of our fire." Rose Red sprang and went to the door, and unlatching it opened, expecting to find a traveler, but instead a great bear's head thrust its way into the cottage. She stepped back, a scream on her lips, and Snow White's already coming from her mouth. Their mother rose, and the bear said, "Do not be afraid. I mean you no harm. I'm simply frozen out here. Would you allow me to sit by your fire?" Now, whether it was a bear that could talk, or the kindness in his voice, their mother sat down in her chair again and said, "Please come in. Take care not to singe your coat near the fire, but please join us." Now Rose Red opened the door a bit further, and Snow White moved to move their things away, and the bear lumbered in, great black coat, white across the top, and settled in front of the fire with a singe and a sizzle. The mother watched her girls as Rose Red closed the door and turned and looked at the great black mountain in front of their fire. Snow White did not sit to her spinning again, and so watching her daughter so concerned, she said, "Rose Red, Snow White, go get your brooms and sweep our guest. Get the snow off his coat so that he'll not be any colder." So they did, and very cautiously approached the bear and began to sweep the white off of his coat onto their stone floor. Well, she could see their hands were shaking from the nervousness, but the bear was grumbling in a contented sort of growl. And so their mother, to soothe them, began to sing. "Black is the color of my true love's hair. His face so soft and wondrous fair. The purest eyes and the strongest hands. I love the ground whereon he stands. I love my love, and well he knows. I love the ground whereon he goes. If you no more on earth I see, I can't serve you as you have me. And their mother singing comforted them. And after the bear had been swept clean and was heaving great sighs, they returned to their spinning and watched the bear as their mother continued to sing and read. And when the time had come to douse the lamps and go to their beds, their mother said, "Please stay the night. You would surely freeze outside." And the bear agreed. And Rose Red and Snow White did not sleep very well that night, but listened to the snoring of their great guest. Now the next morning, Snow White got up to start the fire, and the bear was already standing, his face pointed towards the door, sniffing at the bits of the morning air that were seeping in through the cracks. And she went to let him out and opened the door wide and said, "Surely if it is cold outside tonight as it was last night, you should return and take comfort by our fire." And the bear nodded. And as he left out their door, she reached out and touched the coarse black fur. And so a strange winter was passed. Their guest would arrive every night, and Rose Red made it a point to not lock the door until he had arrived. They grew used to his snores near the fire every night, a strange lullaby. And every morning, Snow White would let him out the door and reach a hand out and let it cross past his hair. And then one day, when the winter had about blown itself out, and the snow that had fallen had melted the same day it had come down, the bear turned to Snow White and said, "I will come again no more. Summer is on its way." "Where will you go, dear bear?" she said. "Will you not come and join us in the evenings?" "No," he said. "The dwarves who seek to steal my treasure will come above ground now that the ground is soft, and I must be out and about to keep them from their business." Well, before she could say much else, the bear swung and was off into the woods again, and she reached out for one last touch, and as he hurried through the door, his hair caught upon the latch and was pulled away, and she saw a glint of gold, but before she could ask him about it, he was gone and into the forest. She told her mother and her sister of the bear's departure, and while they were sorry to see their guest go, spring has its busyness. There were the lambs, there was the garden, there was the preparation for the coming summer, and so they were all quite busy. And then came the day that Rose Red could stand it no longer. She came to her sister Snow White and said, "Leave your broom. The forest is singing to me, and I can bear it no longer. Come, we should go gather firewood. We need it." And Snow White, having spent almost enough time in the house, left her broom. And they went into the forest. And they gathered sticks, and they looked to see where the robins had placed their nests this year, and to see what fresh green shoots were starting to come up. And as they went about, they came across a fallen tree, and they heard a strange noise. And at the end, they saw something hopping and jumping around. And as they came around the back of the tree, near the root and the trunk, they came across a very strange sight. There was a man, a very small man, about the size up to their knees, who had a very long beard, about as long as he was tall. And he somehow was stuck to the tree, and he was pulling at the length of his beard and hopping about like a dog on a leash. And the girls stood and watched him. And then one of them said, "What are you doing?" And his face turned towards them, and it was wrinkled, and his eyes were hard as stones. And he says, "What does it look like I'm doing? I'm stuck. Are your boots and your heads filled with stones, or are you going to come help me?" Well, the girls, being kind-hearted, Rose Red went to pry apart the tree, and Snow White began to tug at the beard. And Rose Red said, How did this happen?" And he said, "Well, I was chopping wood for my fire, and I drove my wedge in, and it slipped, thus catching my beautiful beard and leaving me at the mercy of you two ninnies." Well, they continued to try to pull, and Rose Red said, I will go get help." He says, "What good will that do? There are already two of you too many." Snow White said, wait, let me think for just a moment. And then she reached into her apron and she pulled out her sewing scissors, and before the dwarf could say anything, she snipped off the end of his beard. Well, the dwarf had been pulled at tension, and so when the tension was released, he went flying over backwards, and when he sat up, he inspected his beard and with a shriek went towards the girls. Well, they stepped back, and Rose Red's foot happened to hit a bag that had been hidden among the roots. The dwarf, seeing that she had found it, darted forward and grabbing it, and it jingled of a merry coin. And shrieking at them, he turned and he went into the woods, throwing curses over his shoulder. The girls watched him go and spoke of it a bit, and then they brought the tale home to their mother, and she thought it was quite odd to find a dwarf in their woods, but they really didn't think of it too much longer, because spring began to roll into summer, and the rose bushes outside first showed those green buds, and then they began to show the buds of the roses, and you could see at the very top the red and the white, and you knew that soon they would burst into bloom. And at that time, they had had a very particular busy day, and their mother said, girls, go down to the river, cool your feet, and catch us some fish. The girls did not need to be told twice. Off they went, down to the river, over tree and under tree, until they could see the winding river through the woods. And then they saw a strange sight. There was something hopping along the banks. First it was one step forward, and then it was another step back, but it was slowly and surely getting closer to the water's edge. And they saw that it was their friend, well, acquaintance, the dwarf. And he had somehow gotten his beard tangled in a line with a fish. And this fish, being about the size he was pulling him towards the water. And he would struggle backwards, and then he'd hop forward and struggle backwards. Until finally Snow White said, you're not going to go in there after it, are you? And the dwarf saw them and said, no, help me, you ninnies. And down they came. Rose Red taking the line, and Snow White seeing what she could do to untangle the mess. But it was of no use. It was quite tangled. And so for a second time, Snow White reached into her pocket, pulled out her scissors, and snipped the end of his beard. And they all fell backward into the mud. Well, the girls looked at each other, small grins forming on their faces, but the dwarf sat up and inspected it, and he said, it is not enough that you would ruin it once, but now it is twice shorter, and I will never be able to show myself to my friends again. So distressed was he that he continued to yell, and he reached into the mud at his feet, and he pulled up what seemed to be some weeds. But then he stepped forward, and swishing them in the water, happened to hold strings of pearls. And then continuing to abuse them, he walked down the stream, throwing curses over his shoulder. Well, the girls stood up to start wringing out their petticoats. And as they did so, Snow White touched Rose's arm and said, Rose, look. And across the river was a bear, a great black bear. And Snow White moved forward, and Rose said, no, we don't know if it's our bear. And so Snow White began to sing. Black is the color of my true love's hair. His face so soft and wondrous fair. The purest eye and the strongest hands. I love the ground whereon he stands. The bear stood with his ears turned towards them, sniffing the air. And then he heard the shriek of the dwarf cursing his way down the river, and turned his head that way, and his left lip pulled up in a snarl, and he began to stalk down the riverside. Well, the girls, not wanting to meet with the bear, who did not seem happy and did not seem to be their bear, slowly backed away and went home to their mother with sodden petticoats and a very interesting story to tell. And so the summer continued, and the roses began to bloom. And first there was a white, and then a red, and the fragrance they gave off was just magical. So every day they would go and they'd pluck a stem, and they'd bring it inside to fill the cottage with this smell. And so one day, their mother called them and said, girls, go into town and get some needle and some thread and some ribbon. It is time to do our mending." And so the girls, arm in arm, went out through the woods onto the moor, where the green hills were stretching with the rocks dotted across it. And as they were walking, they happened to notice something very strange happening near the road. There was a large eagle, and it happened to be carrying something that was kicking and screaming and cursing. And the girls, realizing who it was, went to go help him, one taking his foot and the other his hand, and pulling a strange tug of war with the eagle until it let go with a shriek of frustration, and down came the dwarf. As you can imagine, the dwarf was not very grateful. Up he got, looking and saying, "Now you ruined my clothes. First my beard and then my clothes. You would have been eaten. I could have handled myself better than you could." Well, the girls let him continue to scream and fight, and they left him walking along, and they saw him reach beneath a rock, pull out a bag, and it seemed to clatter of stone. But they paid no mind to his strange ways as he went off into the rocks, and they continued on their way down to town. And so they bought their needle and their thread and their ribbon, and they began their way back just as the sun was beginning to set. And they were very close to the woods where the rocks were beginning to get thick when among the green and the gray flashed blue, a strange color to have glimmer from these places. And the girls wove their way between the rocks until they came across the dwarf, who had spilled the bag on the ground. And it was gems. Gems of colors the girls had never seen all in one place. The blue of the troubled ocean, the green of those first buds on the bush, the red of a deep sunset, and the white of a snowfall. And they stood there, staring. And the dwarf saw them staring, and his face went from red to purple, and he began to scream. I knew you had a plan in mind. First you ruined my beard, then my clothes, and now you wish to take my treasure." And down he reached to pick up a rock, and he began to come towards them screaming, and the girls began to back up. And then a growl came. A growl came from the edge of the woods, followed by a great black bear. And the dwarf, turning, dropped the rock and went from purple to white. And the bear came up, looming over the top with his arms outstretched, and the dwarf began to cry. And he said, "Please, I'm too young. I'm too small. Eat those fat girls, please. I'm too small." But the dwarf, his pleas fell on empty ears, because the bear took his paw and crashed it across the dwarf, and the dwarf went tumbling end over end until he hit a rock and moved no more. And the girls, they began to pick up their skirts and run. And they began running for the edge of the forest when they heard a voice behind them saying, "Girls, wait, I will come with you." And they were still running when the voice began to sing. "Black is the color of my true love's hair. Her lips are like the roses fair, the purest eyes and the gentlest hands. I love the ground whereon she stands." And Snow White grabbed her sister, and spinning around, they saw the bear, their bear, coming first on all fours and then standing up on two. And his skin seemed to be moving, it seemed to be writhing, it seemed to be rejecting him. It began to peel away from him until it fell to the ground, and there in front of them stood a man with wild dark hair, dark, wild eyes, in a suit of tattered gold. And the girl stood speechless, but he had thought often of what he might say. And he said, "Please let me explain." "My brother and I are lords of a neighboring province. And as we were riding one day, we came across this dwarf who demanded our treasure. And we would not give it to him. So he cursed us to wear the skins of a bear until we could defeat him. And he continued to steal our treasure, and we continued to hunt him. And as some know, a dwarf keeps his magic in his beard, and because of your kindness to him, Snow White, you shortened his magic, and thus freed us to find him and so defeat him." Well, with some of it explained, the girls invited him home to meet their mother. And while their mother was pleased to have such a fine guest in the house, she insisted she give him a haircut and make him a new suit of clothes. And so refreshed, he went into the woods to find his brother. And he brought out another young man, wild of hair, wild of eye, perhaps more wild than he was, as he had not spent any year in the comfort of humans. And as these stories often go, Snow White happened to marry the bear that stayed with them all winter. And after some mutual taming, Rose Red and the other brother also wed. And the four of them went with their mother to the Lord's palace. And they brought their rose bushes with them, planted them on either side of the gate, where they grew up and around the gate, twining one around the other, one blooming red and the other blooming white.